Hi. Today I'm going to deal with this very interesting subject of Jesus' last Passover. Now I'm referring to the actual Passover feast that Jesus and his disciples conducted on the night before his death. And we want to look at this feast because it has certain important things for us to learn. Firstly, we want to appreciate the symbolism of the Passover feast that Jesus celebrated. And secondly, we want to understand the origin of the Christian practice of the Lord's Supper, or as is also known as the Holy Communion, the Eucharist, or as we refer to it in the assemblies, the breaking of bread. So the Lord's Supper was actually instituted while Jesus was conducting the Passover feast on the night before his death, as you will see in a little while. So I hope you're watching this video on a Thursday night, because as we'll see in a short while, Thursday has special significance as far as this feast was concerned. So let's jump right into this subject of Jesus' last Passover. First question we ask is, well, when did it take place? Let me just say at the outset that it took place on a Thursday night. And immediately I could hear people buzzing and asking, isn't the Passover on a Friday? A common misconception that we have, that a lot of Christians have, is that Good Friday coincides with Passover. So the question is that so? Now I'm going to show you a chart that compares the dates of Good Friday and the Passover for the past 10 years or more, including this year as well as next year. And if you look at this chart, you'll find that Good Friday, of course, always falls on a Friday. But when you look at the Passover, the date for the Passover in each year, it hardly falls on a Friday. So from the year 2010 right up to right now, the Passover has never fallen on a Friday. And next year, for the first time in 10 years, the Passover will fall on a Friday. So you'll be wondering, why is this disparity in dates between Good Friday and the Passover? Didn't Jesus die on the Passover? And if Good Friday was the day that Jesus died, then surely the Passover took place on a Friday. Well, as we could see from the dates that I just showed you, it does not necessarily mean that Good Friday and Passover coincides. In fact, it has not coincided for the past 2,000 years. And what is the reason? Well, in the first few centuries, when the Christians celebrated Easter, they tried to make it as close to Good Friday as possible. So they know that Jesus rose about 3 days after Passover. So when the Jews celebrated the Passover, they had their Easter celebrations a few days later. By the time we come to the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine had become a Christian. And one of the things about him was that he was anti-Semitic. He hated Jews. And he didn't want an important Christian festival like Easter to have anything to do with what the Jews were doing. So he ordered the council that was meeting at Nicaea in the year 325 AD to come up with a new way of calculating the date for Easter. And that was what the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 AD did. They created a formula for calculating the date of Easter, which ensured that Easter would never coincide with the Passover. But we're not here to talk about this subject. The dates of Passover and Easter is really complex, take it from me. And it's going to take a long discussion, so we'll not talk about that today, except just to know this point that that Good Friday does not coincide with the Jewish festival of Passover. Okay, let's get back to our story. Well, in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 5 to 6, we read as follows: The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month, 14th day of the first month, which is the month of Nisan. Then in verse 6, on the 15th day, that is the next day of that month, of the same month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. So we see from the Bible that there are these two festivals that that take place one day after the other. So on the Jewish month of Nisan, on the 14th day, the Passover starts. The next day, the festival of unleavened bread starts. Actually, the Passover festival lasts for 7 days, just like the festival of unleavened bread. Now, so on which day did our Lord celebrate his festival? Let's go to Matthew chapter 26, verse 17. Matthew chapter 26, verse 17, we read this: On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Now, in the Jewish reckoning, a day begins at 6 p.m. So, the day of Passover would begin at 6 p.m. and it will carry on till around 6 p.m. sunset, around sunset of the following day. And at sunset of the following day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts, and it continues to the next day at sunset. So, here we read that on the first day of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So that means Jesus did not eat the Passover on Passover day itself. And Jesus replied in verse 18 and 19 of Matthew chapter 26. He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, 'The teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover." And then to verse 20. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. So the day in which all this took place was on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. Now in the daytime, that would be part of the Passover day, because the Passover day took place, began at 6 p.m. of the previous day. Now, it was impractical to hold the Passover feast on the first night of the Passover day because the lambs would not be ready. It is only the following day in the daytime that the temple would slaughter the lambs for the Passover. So the lambs will only be available for consumption at the Passover feast on the night of the second day. That is the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. So that was what happened. So now if we work backwards, we know that Jesus rose on a Sunday, he died on Friday. Jesus could not have celebrated the Passover on a Friday, the day of his death. We know that he celebrated it on the night before his death, so that is Thursday. So it tells us that Passover day for that year began on Wednesday night, around 5 to 6 p.m. on Wednesday night, and it went on to 5 to 6 p.m. on Thursday night. And it was on Thursday night, after the lambs were obtained from after the lambs were slaughtered and obtained from the temple, that Jesus had his Passover feast. So the time of the Passover feast conducted by Jesus was on Thursday night. The place was the upper room of a house of a friend. No names given, but someone who provided the facilities for Jesus and his disciples. It was, of course, arranged by Jesus, but it was prepared by the disciples. In order to have the lamb ready for consumption at the Passover, the disciples had to buy a lamb, and we read from the Gospels that Jesus instructed Peter and John to get a lamb. So they went to the temple, bought the lamb from the people selling animals outside the temple. They had to slaughter the lamb themselves. The blood of the lamb that was spilled out was collected in a bowl. It would be passed to one priest, who would pass it to a priest next to him, and who would pass it to the priest next to him, and the final priest would then take the blood and splash it on the altar in the temple. And then the animal would be cleaned and skinned and divided up, and the part that is meant for the worshipper would be given back to Peter and John, and they would bring it back for the lamb to be roasted to be made ready for the feast. So let's imagine we are with Jesus. Time is ready, it's evening, and we follow Jesus and his disciples into that upper room to observe them conducting the Passover dinner. So what do we see? It would probably be a bare room, and in that room would be a table. Now, how did the table look like? How did the seating look like? Here you see a popular rendition of the Lord's Supper made by European artists. And of course, the most famous of this, paintings of the Lord's Supper, is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, that is painted on the wall of a church. And you would notice the feet of Jesus was cut off by a dog that was created in that wall. So, now, this is how Europeans eat their dinner. So, when they tried to visualize Jesus having the Last Supper, they actually painted a European dinner. In other parts of the world, the table may be different. In some places, people didn't have tables, they sat on the floor to have their dinner. But the most popular idea that we have of the Last Supper is probably represented by these paintings. So, was this how the table at the Last Supper looked like? Let's look at Luke chapter 22 verse 14, and look at the posture that Jesus and the disciples adopted at the table. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. It doesn't say that Jesus and his disciples sat at the table. It said that they reclined at the table. Recline means you are practically lying down on a surface and propped up with a pillow or propped up with your elbow. That's the meaning of recline. It is not sit. So if you have a table like that shown in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, how does Jesus and his disciples recline at the table? Now let me show you what the table probably looked like. This is the type of table that's found in Oriental houses when they have a feast. So if you look at this slide, you'll notice that the table is in the shape of a U. It's not square shape. It is not rectangular or long. It is in the shape of a U. So here I drew it with angles, but it could be in the shape, it could have rounded edges, but basically it is this kind of shape. And people will sit on the outside of this table. It's a three-sided table, so that food can be brought in from that open side and placed all around the table. Now, let me show you a picture, painting of a feast in an Oriental setting in the Middle East, and you get an idea of what I mean. So there you see a table about maybe 1 to 2 feet off the ground, and people sitting on raised cushions. Now, this is a painting of probably more luxurious setting. It's very unlikely that for Jesus and his disciples at that Passover dinner that they had such luxurious surroundings, but they would have a low table no more than 1.5 feet off the ground, and they would sit on the outside. Now here is another picture, another rendition of the Last Supper by that comes very close to what we are talking about. So here we see a square table. It's not a U-shaped table, but here we see Jesus and his 12 disciples seated around that table, and they are reclining. So they are reclining. This is what I want you to see from this picture, that the position that people took when they reclined at the table to eat a dinner. And now you will understand that story of that woman who came from behind Jesus and washed his feet. In Luke chapter 7 verse 38, we read about this woman. This is what she did. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Now, this woman was standing behind Jesus. If Jesus was seated, how does she wipe his feet with her tears? But if Jesus was reclining at the table, his feet would be behind him. And if the woman came from behind him, the part of his body that she would encounter at first would be his feet. And therefore she could kneel down, wet his feet with the tears, and wipe it with her hair as a very meaningful act of worship. So this was the table that Jesus and his disciples reclined at the Last Supper. Next, we want to look at the seating arrangements. The seating arrangements. Now, who sat where? Now, if you look at the next slide, you will see that I have placed Jesus in the second position. Now, that's a second position at the table. Now, why did I place Jesus at the second position? That's because the tradition of that the Jews have observed for thousands of years was that the head of the family or the host of the dinner occupies the second seat. So we are able to place Jesus at the second seat, so-called seat of this table. So in John chapter 13 verse 21 gives us the clues. Jesus was troubled and he said, one of you is going to betray me. So can you imagine Jesus and his disciples sat at the table, and at this point Jesus said out loud, one of you is going to betray me. I'm sure there was a lot of murmuring. Nobody dared to ask that crucial question, is it me? Everybody kept quiet. They just talked to the people next to them. And then in the next slide, we read John chapter 13 verse 23 to 26. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that is John, was reclining next to him. So this verse tells us that John was reclining next to Jesus. And I put him in the first position at the table. Now, why do I put him in the first position and not on the other side? Well, the tradition of the Jews require that the first position at the table is reserved for the youngest member of the family. The youngest person at the dinner sits at that first position to the right of the host of the dinner. And we know that John was the youngest of Jesus' disciples, and so I put him in that position. Now next, we go on and read this passage. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple, that's John, and said, ask him which one he means. So now it appears to us that Peter was able to speak very naturally to John, which means that he was very close to John. Now, if Peter was sitting at other positions at the table, he wouldn't be able to speak to John. If he tried to do that, he would have to raise his voice, and that would attract the attention of everybody, and it would produce a very awkward moment. But Simon Peter was able to motion to John, make a hand signal, and probably say in a lower tone of voice, ask Jesus which one he means. So therefore I put Peter at the end of the table. So it's the first position if you begin from the other side, but basically it is the end of the table. And we know that Peter was sitting here because later in John chapter 13 verse 5 and 6, or rather earlier, there was this incident where Jesus washed his disciples' feet. We know from the Gospel of Luke that they were arguing over who was to be the greatest because of the seating positions, I presume. Everybody wanted to be seated in the right place. So they argued which among them was the greatest. And we read that Jesus poured water into a basin and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Now, this gives us the idea that the first person whom Jesus washed, whose feet Jesus washed, was Peter. And if you look at the position where I placed Peter, then it makes a lot of sense that if Jesus got up and would go around washing his disciples' feet, he would start with Peter. Okay? Now, we go on. Leaning back against Jesus, John asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Then Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. Now, if you remember the way people recline at table, the only person that Jesus could give that piece of bread that was dipped in the dish to would be the person next to him. So John was seated on this side. He did not give it to John. He gave it to Judas, which means that Judas was sitting or was reclining next to Jesus. So we are able to establish the sitting positions of 4 of those who attended the Last Supper. We know where Jesus sat. We could place John, we could place Judas, and we could place Peter. Now the rest of the disciples sat at the remaining places. As to who sat where, we do not know. All we know with some degree of certainty was that was these 4 positions. So for the guests out of place, at any formal dinner, one of the headaches of a host is deciding who sits where. You put a person in the wrong place, he'll get offended. You put this person next to that person, they may find themselves in an awkward position. So seating positions are very important. So at the last Passover, were the guests at this Passover dinner out of place? And I refer to Judas. Now, the position that Judas occupied next to Jesus is considered to be the place for the guest of honor. On one side of the host, you have the youngest member of the family. On the other side of the host is supposed to be the guest of honor, not the ordinary members of the family. The guest of honor, someone special. So Judas occupied the position of the guest of honor next to Jesus. Peter, whom we all know to be the leader of the disciples, was sitting at the end of the table. He was occupying the last position. So this is very strange. And I asked myself, if I were Jesus, would I have arranged the seating in this way? Would you have arranged the seating in this way? Would you give the seat of honor to a traitor like Judas? I know I wouldn't. I would never give that preferred seat next to the Savior to a person like Judas. But then I'm not Jesus. Would I place Peter at the end of the table? The lowest position, the last position? Well, most of us are concerned with rank and importance and people's feelings. And Peter being such a senior member, the first disciple called by one of the first disciples called by Jesus, and because of his personality, he was the leader of the disciples. I wouldn't put him at the end of the table. But I'm not Jesus. Jesus, in his wisdom, in his grace, in his love, put Judas in the seat of honor. I'm sure we know that Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him. He already said that somebody is going to betray him, and he knew it was Judas. Why did he put Judas in that seat of honor? Was he trying to give Judas a chance to repent? Was he trying to express to Judas that in spite of what you're going to do, the terrible sin you're going to commit, I value you as a soul? And there could be other reasons, and all these reasons that we could think of for Jesus placing Judas next to him in that seat of honor would be noble. Something only the Savior could do. Peter was sitting at the end of the table. Someone who's thought of himself and who was acknowledged by others as a leader was placed in the lowest position. The question is, if you were Peter, would you be able to accept something like this? To accept Jesus' decision not to give you the highest place, but to give you the lowest place. Jesus asking you to humble yourself instead of exalting yourself. Instead of taking the most visible first place, Jesus asks you to take the invisible last place. Would you have the faith, the character to accept where Jesus placed you? But let's move on. Now we want to look at the Passover ceremony now. After we have looked at details which are logistical in nature, we want to now look at the Passover ceremony, Passover dinner which Jesus carried out. Basically, there are three parts. There's the ceremony before the meal or the dinner, then there's the dinner itself, and then the ceremony after the meal. So we are more concerned with the first and the third part. The middle part, which is the dinner, would be like any other festive dinner which the Jews would have. But before the dinner, there was some ceremonies and rituals, and after the dinner was completed, there were further ceremonies and rituals which we will look at in a short while. Now, since it's a Passover feast, we ask the question, what was served? What was served? So, basically for the ceremony, not for the dinner, for the ceremonies before and after the dinner, what was served were primarily 3 pieces of matzah or bread and 4 cups of wine. 3 pieces of matzah, 4 cups of wine. Now, the 4 cups have titles. According to the Jews, they have given titles to these 4 cups. The first cup is called the cup of sanctification. The second cup is called the cup of deliverance. The third, the cup of redemption. The fourth, the cup of restoration. So the question is, why 4? Well, these 4 cups represent the 4 full stages of God saving his people, found in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6 to 7. So in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6 to 7, this is what God said to Moses, who passed this on to the Jews. And then from this passage, they created this practice of having 4 cups at a Passover dinner. God said, I'm the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. So you see, 4 I wills. And the Jews have deduced that the cup of sanctification has to do with the first I will bring you out. The cup of sanctification represents God separating his people from Egypt. The next cup, the cup of deliverance, is based on the words, I will free you. God liberating them from bondage. And the third cup of redemption is, I will redeem you. And this is a picture of the blood of the new covenant, as we will see in a short while. And the fourth cup is a cup of restoration. I will take you as my own people. God will restore Israel from Egypt into the land of Canaan. He will constitute them as his kingdom, his people, and he will rule among them and rule through them. So these are the four cups that are drunk at the Passover feast. Now, besides the bread or the matzah and the four cups, there are other items. You have the maror, which are bitter herbs. Bitter herbs, sometimes they use horseradish, and these bitter herbs are meant to be a reminder of the slavery and the bitter times that the people of Israel encountered in Egypt. There's this dish called the haroth set. It's a paste made up of fruits and nuts. It's a reminder of the mortar that the Israelites made as slaves of Pharaoh. Then there's the zorah, and that is the roasted lamb, the paschal lamb that was eaten on Passover. And then there's the karpas, which are vegetables, for example, parsley, which represents springtime and rebirth. So these are the items that will be placed on the table in readiness for the Passover. So now we ask, how did Jesus conduct the Passover on that night? Well, he would have conducted it very much like the Passover that would be conducted in a lot of homes at that time. So we look at this ceremony before the meal or the dinner. We look at the ceremony before the meal, and it starts off with the first cup, where a prayer of blessing is said over the first cup. And the prayer goes something like this: Blessed are you, Lord our God, or Jehovah, or Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. We thank you for this Passover, the festival of our liberation, a day of sacred assembly, recalling the exodus from Egypt. So, the first cup is then drunk, passed around and drunk, and then it is followed by the erhatz, which is the hand washing. So the participants of the dinner would wash their hands in a basin that was passed around. Now the purpose of hand washing is to symbolize purification. It is to symbolize cleansing. And throughout the course of the dinner, the Passover dinner, it would be carried out a few times. And this is not peculiar only to the Passover feast. We see that hand washing occurs quite frequently in other aspects of Jewish life and religion. It is the heart of Jewish religion. And of course, the whole idea of this washing is to symbolize cleansing and purification. And Jesus gave a lesson to his disciples earlier on when he, or rather later on, when he washed their feet. So we read in John chapter 13 verse 5. So he got up from the meal. So in the course of the dinner, we are not sure at which part of the dinner he got up, but probably around that stage where there was washing of hands. He got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. Okay, then we jump to verse 12 of John chapter 13. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do that. The washing rituals in Jewish religion are rituals, that's all. They are formalities, they are external things. They do not reflect what's inside a person. So the true washing that takes place internally will not only wash away, cleanse a person of sin, but it will produce in him a humble character. It will produce in him the heart of a servant. That was what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples. He was trying to show to them that he, as the Holy One of God, who had no sin inside him, now what was he? He was a servant, and he demonstrated that by washing his disciples' feet. And he told them that the true cleansing, the result of the true cleansing of a person's innermost parts would result in him not only being holy, not only being humble, but he would do the acts of a servant. So while washing was at the heart of the Jewish religion, service is at the heart of our Christian faith. So if we follow Jesus, we will find that all the washings in the world is not going to change us, but the washing that comes from the Holy Spirit is the only thing that can change us. And we see evidence of the change when we follow in Jesus' footsteps, being able to serve one another. Now, after the washing ritual, the diners at the dinner would come to this stage called karpas, that is eating of the vegetables. So a prayer of blessing is uttered, and they eat the vegetable dipped in salt water. The purpose of this is to remember the suffering and the tears during the time of slavery in Egypt. Now, after eating the vegetables, you come to this important and interesting part of the dinner is called the yahats. The yahats, that's the dividing of the middle matzah. Now, what they have would be 3 pieces of matzah. That's what the Jews call the bread matzah, 3 pieces. And today they create a pouch with so that you can put with 3 compartments, so that you can put 3 pieces of matzah separately in each compartment. So I put a picture of a nice little pouch with 3 matzah inserted inside. And what the host of the dinner does is that he takes out the middle matzah. That means the second piece, he takes it out from the pouch or the cloth, and he breaks it in half. He then takes the bigger piece and he wrap it up in a piece of cloth, and he'll get up from the table, he'll leave the dinner, and he'll hide that piece of matzah somewhere. And then he'll return to his table, and the smaller piece of matzah, he'll put it back into the middle portion of the pouch. This is what he does. And before you ask any questions about why is this done, what's the purpose, we are going to talk about this later on. Let me just tell you that the reason for this little practice will be explained later on as we go to the rest of the dinner. Now, let's just take a glimpse of the matzah. So what I have for you is a picture of the matzah. It's a flat piece of bread. It's made from flour with salt and water. That's all. No yeast in it. And it's baked over a flat pan or griddle. And as a result of the baking, it looks something like this. It could be square, it could be round, but basically this is the matzah. And during the Passover dinner, as the matzah is held up, this is what the host says: "This is the bread of misery which our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. All that are hungry, come and eat. all that are needy come, keep the Passover. Then the host of the dinner bless the matzah. He says a prayer, and then they eat the matzah. They pass it around, and they share in it. Now, after this, the second cup is filled. Now, it's not drunk yet. The second cup is filled, and this sets the stage for remembering the events of the Exodus. Remember, the Passover feast is meant to be a festival to commemorate and to celebrate the liberation of the Israelites from the land of Egypt. So, and it consists of asking 4 questions, and also the explanation and recounting of Israel's deliverance through reading of the scriptures or through storytelling. So, the 4 questions are called the Magid. The first question would be asked by one of the diners, and is usually asked by the youngest member. So in this case, probably John would be given the responsibility to ask this question. He would say something like, why do we eat only matzah on this night? And the answer that will be given by the host is something like this: we eat matzah because when we left Egypt, we had no time to wait for the dough to rise. The second question would be, why do we eat bitter herbs on this night? And the answer would be, we eat bitter herbs to reflect on the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. The third question is this: why do we dip twice on this night? And the answer that would be given would be, we dip twice in order to picture both Israel and Egypt going into the Red Sea. We swallow the parsley after the second dipping to picture that the Egyptian army was swallowed up by the sea. And the fourth question, why do we recline at table on this night? And the answer would be, we recline at the table with a pillow on our chair to picture that the salvation that God has given us has made us a free people. In Egypt, we had to stand and eat. There was no rest or freedom for us. So these are the 4 questions. It sets the stage for further reading of the scriptures and the retelling of the Exodus story. So now the closing of the ceremony at this stage is done by singing the Hallel Psalms. That is Psalm 113 and Psalm 114. After they sing the Hallel Psalms, then they drink the second cup. Of course, before they drink the second cup, a prayer is said over the second cup, which is a prayer of blessing, where the host says something like this: Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. So this sort of brings the ceremony before the dinner to a close. But the Passover ceremonial dinner is not concluded yet. We have reached only the halfway stage of the Passover dinner. At this stage, then the diners have their dinner. And in our next video, we're going to look at what happens after the diners have finished their dinner. Stay tuned.